I'm recalling a story of a life-threatening illness that my husband George had in November of 2007. I remember very distinctly on a Friday taking him to his family doctor because he was finding it more and more difficult to walk because of some pain that he had. But he was seeing his family doctor on Friday, and so he decided he didn't want to go to emergency. He'd rather see his doctor. I took him to the doctor on Friday. The doctor took one look at him and told him to go to emergency at the Dartmouth General immediately, which we did. When we arrived at emergency, first of all, we discovered that his surgeon, Dr. John Murdoch, was off that weekend, and so he wasn't available. But they sent another surgeon to see him, Dr. Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell saw him, sent him for x-rays, and diagnosed him with necrotizing fasciitis. I remember him sitting on the side of the bed and telling George that it was very serious, that he had to undergo emergency surgery, and that he knew that that would be a difficult decision for him to make. George asked him to talk to Dr. Murdoch, and he said he did. He called Dr. Murdoch at home. Dr. Murdoch agreed with his diagnosis and encouraged George to have the surgery. Because George trusted Dr. Murdoch, he trusted Dr. Mitchell because Dr. Murdoch was endorsing him. And we made some calls to family while we were waiting for the OR to be ready. I remember George's brother and sister-in-law coming to see him, having prayers, and then they left. My sister Candace came. She came with a blanket and some tea for me. She knew it would be a long night. She offered to stay, and I said, no, I'll be fine. You go home. She had a young daughter at home. And somewhere in the middle of the night, I remember Dr. Mitchell coming, shaking me on the shoulder, waking me up, and telling me that the situation was worse than he thought it was, and that it was going to be a very long night. He also said that the condition was beyond what he could handle at the Dartmouth General, that he was sending George over to Halifax, that he had already consulted with one of his mentors, a surgeon in Halifax, and that George would be moved there. And he was so calm and reassuring. And he said to me, he said, you need to call someone. I don't want you here alone. It's going to be a very long night. George is very, very ill. And I remember saying, but I'm the person in my family that people call when they need to be comforted. I don't know who I would call. The one person I thought about was my daughter, and she was living in Toronto at the time. And he repeated, you have to call someone. I do not want you here alone. He was so insistent. And he was in his scrubs, like he literally had stepped out of the OR to come and give me an update. So I called my sister, and she came immediately. By this time, they were moving George to Halifax by ambulance. I asked if I could go in the ambulance. They said no, because they had two attendants, a nurse and a surgeon, were going. When we arrived in Halifax, they put me in a room, a family room, to wait. Candace and I waited. And eventually, we heard from the doctors. George, was so sick. That continued for about 10 days. He was in very, very critical condition. And I remember the surgeon saying on day 10, after 9 surgeries, that he said, today I have hope. But I remember thinking back over this whole journey, I guess part of why Dr. Mitchell was so insistent that I have someone with me, and part of the reason why they wouldn't let me go in the ambulance was because they weren't sure George was going to make it. So although they had these concerns, they were so attentive and caring and supportive and kind to me. They just did what I would call culturally responsive care. They provided such culturally responsive, culturally sensitive, such nuanced care that I didn't even realize how critical things were until I looked back on that initial intervention sometime later. I've decided to share this story because I believe that others in the healthcare system can learn from the way in which Dr. Mitchell and his colleagues were able to provide such excellent care, not only to George, who was the actual patient, but also to me, his spouse, who was sitting by his side every single day, attending not only to the patient, but to the caregivers is part of the healthcare system. And the ideal of culturally responsive care makes that system work so much more impactfully when there's a relationship, when there's a sense of hope, even in the most critical situations. I'm very grateful for such culturally sensitive, culturally responsive care. And it's the kind of care that I think everyone deserves.